Hello and welcome to Autology, the podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. Today's episode is this year's mobility-centric recap of last week's annual CERAWeek conference, and you're here with me, Rebecca Bell-Chambers, and Graham Evans, Director of Electrification Technology Research with S&P Global Mobility. Hi Graham, thanks for joining Autology today.
Hi Rebecca, yeah, great to be back on.
So today's podcast is all about CERAWeek 2025, held once again in Houston, Texas. Billed as the world's premier energy event and described by the Financial Times as the Davos of energy, and now by Time magazine as the industry's most influential annual conference, CERAWeek is now in its 43rd year. This year's key theme was moving ahead, energy strategies for a complex world. So maybe, Graham, if we can start with the first question, if you could tell us a little bit of the scope of CERAWeek as a conference and as a whole, and maybe what is S&P Global Mobility's presence there, and maybe you can expand on some of these key themes.
Yeah, sure, Rebecca. Thanks very much. Yeah, delighted to be back on speaking about CERAWeek this year. And I mean, once again, it's fundamentally this is an energy gathering. It's where the CEOs and senior leaders and political leaders come together with our vice chairman Dan Yergin and senior leaders across S&P to talk about major happenings in the energy world. So we've got CEOs from the likes of Saudi Aramco, Total Energies, Chevron, etc. there to kind of go discuss their strategies and in the background do deals. The political discourse continues to be a really major element of the event. This year, we've had the new US Energy Secretary Chris Wright there, the likes of Doug Burgum, Secretary of the Interior. So quite US centric, but not necessarily always. Politicians from other important energy nations too. The executive level of attendance really goes right through the event from the plenaries right through to my panel, for example. So last year's big draw was Bill Gates. This year we had the BlackRock CEO Larry Fink in attendance. I was fortunate enough to have CEOs from the likes of Terra Lithium. So Jeff Alvarez was on my lithium panel. Nano One CEO Dan Blondal was on my mobility decarbonization panel. So we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. But yeah, in terms of the theme, yeah, you mentioned moving ahead, energy strategies for a complex world. This was the theme of CERAWeek 2025, and yeah, interesting on several levels. Obviously, complex might be something of an understatement, but as many of you know, countries totaling 4.1 billion people voted or had the opportunity to hold elections in 2024, and that's against a backdrop of the fact that we've got global wars going on, regional wars taking place. So it's an incredibly complex world, and it's incredibly complex to have a forward-looking view on what that means for energy. But of course, having some of the most influential people in the energy world together in one conference hall to discuss it is a really unique opportunity. I think the theme comes across in a joint article that was written by Autology and Dan Yergin from S&P Global in cooperation with the CEO of Lazard, one of the world's biggest asset managers, a gentleman called Peter Orzag, to preface the conference. And this was called The Troubled Energy Transition: How to Find a Pragmatic Path Forward. And yeah, Peter actually discussed this in his session, which was chaired by the S&P Global CEO Martina Jung. And he said, obviously, whilst we might talk about this as an energy transition at the moment, probably the term energy addition is a better term, because we're going to need more energy. That's a fact. Achieving net zero by 2050 will require somewhere in the region of 5% of GDP per annum by 2050 towards this energy goal. Perhaps he described this as 10% if we exclude the developing nations who don't have 5% of GDP to offer, right? So this is a huge commitment of capital on behalf of nations to go after the target of net zero. And yet, against the backdrop of this, we've seen cost reductions in renewables, somewhere to the tune of 90% in solar technology in 15 years. So obviously, these cleaner technologies do get cheaper as scale increases. When we mention that energy addition, that was almost kind of discussed throughout the conference in the context of AI and data centers. No one could really get away from that term in any panel. It's such a hot topic, and a great stat. I think it was the CEO of ADNOC, the state oil company from Abu Dhabi. He said a Chat GPT search uses 10 times the energy of a Google search. So obviously, if people are performing their searches in ChatGPT instead of in Google, you're going to be using 10 times the amount of energy just in that one operation. And the idea that perhaps further down the track, humans with AI will replace humans without AI. So this is not necessarily going to be detrimental to jobs. It's just going to be that the humans who've harnessed AI in the most effective way are going to be the most capable and have the most capability moving forward. Managing peaks and troughs in energy was also a big discussion point, and this plays into this narrative around the fact that maybe the renewables in terms of their capacity or their quantity are just not quite there yet. And it was the CEO of Total Energies, he said that would actually with stationary storage with 4-hour batteries that you could manage 99.5% of electricity loads. So that sounds really impressive, but if you work that out over the course of the year, that's 44 hours without electricity, which I'm sure most of us would agree that's not acceptable. So we wouldn't want to go, almost 2 days of the year without electricity. So some sort of fossil fuel buffer is still required for the grid. And yeah, it was Saudi Aramco who chimed in as well a bit around the intermittency challenges of renewables. They've made huge investments in renewables, and they've also seen that they need to make huge investments in storage in order to make them viable. Lots of talk about LNG, liquefied natural gas, being that fuel that can be used to support data center loads, using what they call combined cycle firing. It was a quote that someone said is actually in the internal precursor to the week, where they said, no one wants to breathe clean air in the dark, right? So ultimately, we all agree that we want to breathe clean air, but at the same time, we don't want to do that in the dark. So certainly we need more energy in order to ensure that that happens, and that came across perhaps in several ways. And the idea of this kind of like managed transition really is very important. In terms of some of the political discourse, as you can imagine, it's a slightly different tone this year, especially in some of the bigger plenary sessions. But I mean, across, when you listen to some of the oil majors, saying they're going to reduce their Shell saying they're going to reduce their low carbon investment by some 60-70%. They're going to go after hydrocarbon growth instead. It's certainly the case that priorities have changed as a result of the change in the political discourse. But we do know that technology can be an enabler that can change politics. And someone used this bicycle analogy of whereby, once you ride a bike faster, it stabilizes, and you get your balance, and the kind of equilibrium in the system improves. And actually, once you have good technologies delivered at scale, that actually the political environment becomes less toxic. And I think that that's a really valid point. So yeah, that's kind of the key themes for CERAWeek, really. And we'll go into the mobility bit in a second. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge event. Somewhere around 10,000 attendees this year. So it's hard to get to everything with so many sessions running concurrently, and lots to digest.
Yeah, it sounds like a busy week, and I bet, if you could divide yourself up, you'd go to all of the sessions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
lots to cover
Mm-hmm.
there. So just diving into some of the more mobility focused aspects, could you maybe tell me a bit more about the kind of mobility led sessions, and maybe what we can take from them, and any other sessions that maybe straddled the mobility landscape?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to. So yeah, from S&P Global Mobility, yeah, there was four of us there acting as session hosts and chairing panels, so including myself and our division president Joe Lafair. So we there's other sessions that kind of this nice link between what we do in mobility and the broader kind of transportation landscape and energy demand landscape. So into things like trucking and shipping. There was a broader kind of zero emissions panel hosted by our colleague Daniel Evans. He he kind of chaired this session, which was looking around sort of aviation and shipping as well. And kind of one of the key themes from this was, let's say, decarbonisation, but not at any cost. big focus on aviation is the application of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, and indeed lots of discussion about a synthetic sort of synthetic fuel derived from renewable energy. So you will get this synthetic aviation fuel from created using wind or solar. And really the demand for this moving forward can potentially be huge, as it's the most effective way to decarbonize aviation, and obviously we know that that's a really difficult sector to go after. And the challenge being really that if you mandate this, that's one thing, but you could put smaller, low margin airlines that are super cost sensitive, you could put them out of business quite quickly. So we have to be careful how quickly we deploy this. And of those ESAF potentials, maybe methanol is the one that jet fuel could act as jet fuel in the long term. And biofuels is an interesting discussion, especially in the context more generally around whether this is something for light vehicle, and the idea that actually, because it's limited in its stock at the moment, that there's other sectors like aviation that need it more pertinently, because the other decarbonisation options just aren't quite so viable. On shipping, that came up in that panel as well. That we in shipping with sort of this aspect of bunkering, where the fuel is stored, where the ship pulls into a port or has to refuel. This idea that if you introduce more than one fuel, you need infrastructure to support more than one fuel. And actually, they need to develop a level playing field really for these alternative fuels, because the competition, the margins in shipping are just so brutal that someone using an alternative fuel and taking a hit on their margin is just not good for business. We'll mention in a second my panel where there's a kind of decarbonisation theme where we were discussing batteries versus hydrogen versus biofuels. Maybe get onto that in a second. But there were several panels with my colleagues discussing electric vehicle adoption, as you can imagine. First one with a North American focus, chaired by my colleague Mario Franchevich. 2024 BEV figures in the United States, or let's say 8% battery electric vehicle sales, with an additional 2% plug-in hybrid electric vehicle sales. It's interesting, the colleague from Southern California, Edison, who joined the panel, stating that there's still the objective in California to hit 68% battery electric vehicle adoption by 2030, and indeed they're at 35% already this year. So in certain parts of certain states, it's happening much quicker than others, that's for sure. Interesting context and comment from one of the OEMs who was on that panel, to say that battery electric vehicle owners have 20% more insurance claims than ICE owners at this stage. Perhaps a sensitivity to the vehicle sensitivity regarding getting it repaired, and some of the incidents that happen with these, people not wanting to take a risk or continue with the vehicle without getting it thoroughly checked over. Also, the fact that dealers are being encouraged to get more living experience of EVs. So this particular OEM was stating that the salespeople have almost as much resistance as the customers sometimes, and they were doing some secret customer testing or assessments in Australia, where an employee went in as a secret customer and challenged the dealer. They said, we want to buy an EV, but actually the dealer would kind of coax them back to the idea of a hybrid or an internal combustion engine vehicle, even when they said they wanted an EV, because they just felt more comfortable selling them. And it was it wasn't almost something they felt necessarily comfortable with. So there's a real need for the education process down to the dealer level. Separate panel hosted by Anup Desai, our consulting lead in mobility, and really around the idea of whether EV uptake will happen faster or slower. I would say that the general consensus was that the pace is likely to be slower than we've been thinking about in previous years, and that one of the panelists there suggesting that, let's say, the EVs, their wow factor, things like acceleration is great, but also the fact that something like a pickup truck has this utility around vehicle to home and being a backup for the grid, what a valuable feature this is in certain markets. So it's almost a kind of a change on the part of the car companies. Are they trying to be tech companies? Are they trying to be car companies? Do they really know what they want to be anymore? And also the point was made about, really, what are we doing EV for now? Do we understand whether the motivation is economic or is it environmental? And the kind of consensus being the fact that for China, who are leading in this, it's more the former. That China are doing this for economic reasons. They're trying to gain a foothold and a leadership position in the global car industry, and that their motivation in this is primarily economic. But there's no two ways about it that this is an emotive subject. Several people asking questions in the panel, and several of the discussions around electric vehicles, that if you make the switch to EV, that you won't go back. And also the fact that retention of EV owners is really not a challenge. People who have got into an EV and got used to an EV will stay with an EV, and really some quite passionate defense of it. So yeah, lots going on, and lots of kind of balanced views, even against this backdrop of the political environment, and thinking that maybe EV is going to go out of focus, or it'll get less government support. Interesting comment around the emissions. Still obviously, life cycle emissions is very much in focus, and one of the OEMs on one of the panels stated that actually, when you think about an IC vehicle over the course of its lifetime, that 400 megatons of the emissions is coming from the tailpipe, 100 megatons is coming from the manufacturing, and actually for that OEM, 98% of those manufacturing emissions are actually from the suppliers, so they're out of their control, which felt like a kind of sort of hands off, or washing their hands of the problem a little bit. Once it's out the gate, it's not their problem. What could they do? And even in manufacturing, well, it's not our bits, what they can do. But I think that certainly in terms of ownership of the problem, and it's something maybe we'll discuss in terms of the mechanisms for measuring emissions around scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. We need to get a better handle on who takes responsibility for what, and exactly how we count emissions.
Yeah, sure. That ownership sounds a bit like a game of hot potato there. Okay,
Absolutely.
great. So, quite a wide range of subject matter actually involved, and certainly lots to talk about from the mobility side. But one thing I think we can both agree on is there's definitely an air of skepticism around electric vehicles still. So, more to be addressed there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can tell me a bit more about the panels that you led. So, since one of these was discussing alternatives, so maybe you could just touch on who you were speaking with, and what came out of the discussion from those panelists.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the the panel that I was discussing around fuel, or that I led around fuel choice. So we had kind of a nice, healthy debate between, let's say, batteries, hydrogen, and biofuels from three industry participants. So we had Dan Blondal, CEO of Nano One, who I mentioned before, LFP battery cathode manufacturer, making their kind of market entry in stationary storage, I would say first, but obviously aspirations to be in the automotive sector. Was have Bill Elric from the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership out in California, so representing the hydrogen space, and then Jennifer Oron Pilgrim, who was VP of R&D and Innovation at Marquis. So maybe those of you who don't know, Marquis are kind of like low carbon feed and fuels business with a big plant in Illinois, supply much of the biofuel that's being used in the US and also globally. So I mean, yeah, the discussion with Dan, I mean, obviously, as Nano One are a Canadian-based company, so it's really been a bumpy couple of weeks in terms of the tariff discussion, and obviously hugely impactful for them, given that they're planning to they're not just have their corporate headquarters in Canada, but they also have their first manufacturing facility in Canada. They discussed a little bit, obviously, the LFP lithium iron phosphate battery chemistry is really at a point now where it's going to have broadly comparable energy density to the nickel, cobalt, manganese incumbent, let's say, and really can compete in that sense with modifications to the battery pack and the internals. So real progress being made there. At the same time, breaking China's stranglehold on this particular chemistry choice and the kind of intermediate chemical processing associated with that is going to be really tough. And the Korean battery manufacturers are certainly trying to leverage some of this and use this as an advantage that they have with their trade relationship with the United States to establish a foothold with LFP chemistries as well as NCM chemistries. But a company like Nano One really has the opportunity to lead if in the North American market, if they can bring their technology to scale first. And and yeah, I mean they we do have the situation whereby in markets like energy storage, this is their target market. They can get people investing in this, as the long term technology, rather than this being kind of like short term transactions. So it feels as though the business model for Nano One looks good. Of course, there's a scale up challenge, but yeah, great to have Dan discuss this. As regards to hydrogen discussion with Bill, I mean, when we talk about scale of some of these new technologies, it's certainly kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to hydrogen. The technology works, but at the same time, it's not just a cost-effective zero emissions technology, but at the same time, it can be market-driven. It can be implemented similar to petrol from a refueling perspective in terms of production, distribution, and end use, and yet the infrastructure is so expensive. This really holds back the build out of scale. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that every stakeholder in every stage of the market continues to incur like a financial loss until the scale can be achieved. So really, it needs kind of continued commitment to the vision, the funding, and the kind of consensus around the long term plan. And Bill's sort of point was that hydrogen is really yet to receive this kind of electrify everything level of support that we've seen in something like EV and or something like solar, right? As a comparison. So yeah, I'd say bumpy times still for hydrogen, even though we've got significant commitment to hydrogen hubs in the United States, and we're seeing some progress in this kind of medium and heavy duty commercial vehicle space. I think the discussion with Jennifer around biofuels, I mean, these biofuels has really been kind of like the poster child for decarbonisation so far, and the fact that they've got really quite large quantities of ethanol being produced in Illinois. They're kind of one of the first movers in this market, and yeah, making somewhere around 500 million gallons of ethanol in Illinois, like 50 somewhere between 50, 60,000 truckloads per year. And really, I suppose they got this right in terms of the timing. They had the tech. They were the first biofuels exporter from the US. They also have quite a good location in Illinois because they have the kind of corn stocks. It's where a lot of the corn production takes place in the United States, and then also access to the Mississippi River to transport this out. So, this has given them a kind of a great foothold in this area. They've then moved into the kind of sustainable aviation fuel space. Synthetic aviation fuel, as we discussed earlier. The idea that the biofuel can contribute to that. They're now also moving into CCS, carbon capture and storage, and they can effectively sequester somewhere in the region of 1 million metric tons of carbon in their production plants. So they're effectively carbon neutral now. They have net zero carbon dioxide emissions in their industrial complex there in Illinois. So it's a really kind of quite nice case study of exactly how you can bring a low carbon technology to market, see it grow in scale, and then if you like, take care of the emissions from the production side, and treat it effectively to be carbon neutral.
Wow, great. That sounds really fascinating. And I think overall, a really nice breadth to the discussion that you had there. Maybe you could touch on your other panel that you had?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the second panel was more around lithium, actually, and it was an interesting discussion around new technology in the lithium space, and in terms of mining, with let's say, with a particular focus on a technology called direct lithium extraction. So, yeah, three industry participants: Nicholas Lugansky, head of mining at SLB. Jeff Alvarez, who I mentioned earlier from Terra Lithium, and Ali Thurmond, who's the VP of US Lithium at Equinor. So if I mention about these companies and what we discussed, I mean, so SLB, Nicholas from SLB, I mean, SLB is Schlumberger, who many of you might have heard of. And they mentioned, in terms of their subsurface expertise, subsurface as a term came up quite often in the conference as a politer way to say mining, I would say. And obviously, there's a huge amount of innovation in the mining sector to get things out of the ground in a more a more efficient, a more cost effective, and more environmentally friendly way. So SLB certainly been at the forefront of this. They have a very established presence. They're not a new player, and really this DLE, direct lithium extraction, is effectively a new method. It's not necessarily been widely accepted so far because of it having higher costs. Nicholas was able to kind of drill down into this and explain this kind of like shorter process of getting lithium from the brine, that you're not using forced evaporators, and that they have these specialized membranes which can remove water but not waste the water. So overall, in the kind of lithium mining process, it's got a much lower water usage generally. And actually, this can be kind of, we talked a bit about pricing throughout the panel. Lithium has obviously had this kind of boom in price, and then it's come back down again. And actually, we discussed a little bit around what that sweet spot would be for different technologies to make them viable. Jeff was coming at this from perhaps a relatively similar perspective, but with a slightly different tech. Occidental, or Oxy, as many of you know, again, established as a major player in the oil business. They have this kind of side, kind of almost like incubator of new technologies, smaller businesses exploring different technological solutions to broaden the portfolio. And lithium they deem as part of their long-term strategy. They're playing the long game on this, and they actually said, well, one of the best times to develop some new projects like this is when commodity prices are low, like they are at the moment, comparatively low. And actually, the fact that this U.S. administration's appetite for local production now, direct lithium extraction really kind of facilitates that, because it's making good use of the lithium resources that are there in the United States. And then, yeah, thirdly, Ali Thurman from Equinor. Obviously, most people will know Equinor. They are the Norwegian state oil company, and again, they are looking to diversify. They're looking to invest in the lithium space and act as the extractive or refining partner, not necessarily like a pure miner, but supporting with the certain aspects of it. So that's why they've kind of gone into this as a kind of a partner with other mining with other mining companies. So they've taken a 45% share in two mines in southwest Arkansas and East Texas, and again providing that kind of subsurface expertise, project execution capability that they have from the oil world, and take that into lithium to deliver at scale. And I say, in terms of the key themes, really, partnerships kind of came out as a key theme. Bringing different levels of expertise, kind of from around these extractive industries. We've learned a lot over the last however many 100 years about getting hydrocarbons out the ground. Some of this can be applied to lithium, certainly, and be used to improve the process. But also, these partnerships can be used to spread and mitigate some of the risk. There's certainly a perception that with any new technology, there's a risk. There's the lead time up front, there's the investment required. Perhaps some of the oil majors are well placed to commit here because they have the money to do so, and some of these US mandates mean there'll be more focus on some of these US based resources, and how best can they monetize them, and how best can they do this in an environmentally friendly way. So, yeah, kind of in summary, this direct lithium extraction is still considered risky. I think that's fair to say. The West are somewhat, Western nations are pursuing it due to the locality and the fact that they would not have to rely so heavily on countries in the, let's say, in the global East for the lithium itself, and certainly in terms of the processing. And they're also trying to prove that it can be a cleaner way to do it, right? And that's really important when you're trying to get licenses to operate in some of these mineral rich communities.
That's super. That sounds like a really engaging and quite frankly important discussion that you had there. So that sounds great. I'm pleased to hear that you're also optimistic. So that's good to hear. Do you have any broader thoughts on the impact of all of this on the wider adoption of EVs now that you reflect back on the conference as a whole?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of mixed emotions, really, I suppose, and I think what it really brought me back to was the fact that financing really is a hugely important enabler when it comes to any new technology, EV or otherwise, and some of the discussions around appetite for risk around new technologies is really helpful, and the fact that what people need, what they rely on is yeah, okay, they need a lot of money. Prodigious capital is required to develop some of these new technologies, but you also need reliable support, people who are perhaps in it for the long run. The example of China was made. People probably think that a lot of the story around China is at the national level, but actually the point was made that regional and state level governments in China have actually potentially been more important to drive innovation and and support for new technologies, perhaps in some of the regional hubs. You see what's happened around Shenzhen or Chongqing, some of these mega cities that have sprung up around certain technologies or certain industry sectors, and it's been really kind of more regional or state level investment that's driven them. In the US, the idea that the sort of investment from the philanthropic sector rather than the government sector is perhaps more effective. That the appetite for risk is a bit higher. Probably Bill Gates and his various ventures is probably a good example of that. The fact that he's really committed to finding battery technologies that will work. He's really committed to these small nuclear plants that can generate really large amounts of energy for relatively small input, and actually this is a really good way to go about innovating faster. And obviously we couldn't really get around tariffs as a topic at CERAWeek, but one of the points that was made that probably when it comes to financing we have to be really careful with something like tariffs, and in this time of such great flux associated with trade and tariffs and policy, no one really wants to do business. If it might be all well and good companies saying they'll relocate, but who's going to fund that relocation? Are you going to go to a big asset manager and get the funding that you need for your relocation if the winds of change might mean that that's not necessary in 6 months time? So the whole backdrop of the event was the discussion was against such a feeling of uncertainty. So this, I think, this is one of my kind of key takeaways, really, and obviously that the effect on a technology like electric vehicles or hydrogen as an investment for medium heavy. It's certainly something that we want a kind of a degree of consistency of long term financial and political commitment to this, the steady stream of capital to make it work, and then the right levels of support at government. I think one of the other interesting discussions was around the kind of 1.5 degrees again, and this came up last year about whether we kind of already overshot this, and was it ever possible in the first place? And I think that one of a couple of really great panels talking about this, and the fact that they think as of January 2025 we're already at 1.75 degrees of global warming versus prehistoric times, and that practically really we need to get back to what we can actually control. Someone made the analogy that something like CCS that we mentioned earlier, it's a really valuable technology to kind of grab the carbon and put it back in the ground, right? But it just can't scale quickly enough, and that there's actually something of a kind of whack-a-mole approach being employed when we kind of what we're actually going after, what we're trying to suppress here, and we can't do everything at once. We mentioned about the scope emissions, and actually the point around double counting. When you try and divide up a company's emissions into the scope 1, 2, 3, it just doesn't really work. And how are we going to get a handle on this problem if we can't count emissions effectively? And really what we should do is count it like we count a dollar through the economy, right? If a dollar goes through the economy from the bottom of the supply chain to the top, then we would count it right. And if we could put policy in place to do the same with carbon emissions, then it would be much more effective. So that accounting piece needs to be right. And the measures to do this are improving, but obviously sometimes when we average everything, it just dilutes the effectiveness of the measures that have been put in place. So yeah, the underlying bit that was sort of mentioned from academics, which I think is important, is that it really needs to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions. It's not net zero CO2, and again, just to be sure that we're counting the right thing and we're measuring the right thing. Another comment around COP as well. I mean, obviously the relevance of COP, and essentially, what was the value of COP moving forward? I think we've seen mixed views on where COP has been located and what the agenda of the host country is going to be. The next one is in Belém in Brazil, and of course, naturally, there'll be a big focus on forestation or deforestation as is critical to that part of the world. Essentially the COP is an opportunity sometimes for the smaller countries to get a seat at the table, and actually one of the big really we would get a lot more done if we could find ways, for example, to get cement decarbonized in its usage in major economies. Actually that somewhere like the G7 or the G20 would be a much better forum to demand action on some of the big emitting countries or the big emitting industries. And yeah, I can't help but think about the comment that the new Energy Secretary Chris Wright made about the UK, and it's almost kind of like act of self sabotage, and kind of almost decarbonising by removing heavy industry from the UK, and yet at the same time outsourcing much of our need for steel and um, need for energy to other countries where they're going to do it in a less environmentally friendly way, then ship it back on a boat. I think he might have a point there, and actually the economies in the pursuit of net zero just need to be careful that they're doing it in a financially viable and sustainable way.
Agreed. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Graham. Really interesting. And just to kind of wrap up your week at CERAWeek, is there any further comments that you'd like to maybe share about CERAWeek as a whole?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and yeah, I mean, once again, it's a privilege to be involved in CERAWeek, and for Mobility to be part of this broader discourse on energy, and it really is a great intersection and an opportunity to discuss some of these intersections where obviously mobility and energy are kind of inseparable in so many ways. So it's a great chance for us to be involved, and obviously the slowdown in the pace of electric vehicle adoption has presented us with a slightly different but also an extremely important narrative. So yeah, I think the feeling coming away from CERAWeek this year is a bit mixed. There's this kind of pragmatism meets prevarication, which manifests itself in a lot of what was discussed, and yet at the same time, I think especially in the Agora area of CERAWeek, it seems clear that most are kind of steadfast in their respective missions. Whether that's decarbonisation, whether that's energy addition, energy transition. There's still a huge amount of commitment from industry, from academia, and from governments to keep that going, and yeah, a lot of great innovation on display certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds great, and just the caliber of people that you have there and the discussions that were
Mm,
were held during that week, it sounds
absolutely.
invaluable, to be honest. So
Hmm.
yeah, like you say, really great to be involved, and already looking forward to next year, right?
I hope so. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great event.
Cool. So, just one last question before we wrap up, and it's a bit on the lighter side. So, since it was held in Houston, Texas, I just wondered if you managed to make it to a rodeo this year whilst using Houston.
I did. Yeah, I did. I made it to the rodeo for the first time. It seems kind of incredible that the world's preeminent energy conference is being held at the same time as the biggest cultural event in Texas, that is the annual rodeo. So yeah, and yeah, obvious signs of some of the Texas-based energy companies and the U.S. automotive brands sponsoring chariot racing and oil majors. Getting involved to sponsor some of the rodeo events. So yeah, it was fascinating to get the opportunity to see this. I don't know if I'll ever see 5 and 6 year old children riding sheep ever again in my life, but it was certainly quite the experience aside from CERAWeek. So yeah, just as integral to the Texas culture as CERAWeek is, maybe.
Absolutely. Maybe goes down in history as one of the must see things, right? Something you got to see once in your life. And I'm sure those branded carts and the sponsorships were no accident there. So yeah, lots to think about.
Oh
Maybe
no.
an S&P sponsored one next year.
Yeah, I would say it was Texas culture in a nutshell. Yeah, really, really, really quite something.
I'm sure. Well, great. Thank you so much, Graham. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I just want to say a big thank you for joining Autology.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me back on.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. And thank you to all of our listeners as well for tuning in. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all of the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.